Okay, this is our second short lecture for Latin America and the Caribbean. Again, what I'm going to do here is briefly talk about the structures and the sequences for our major culture groups. And actually, I want to start with the Caribbean culture. Again, I talked about this on Wednesday when we were having electronic difficulties. The main point I want to make here is the way that migration happened. Again, we have two groups. It is very clear that the Arawakan population moved first through the region. What we see here is about 500 BC. The Arawaks move from the Orinoco Basin here and begin to migrate up the island chain, most notably forming significant populations on Dominica, Grenada, and then finally to the north in St. Vincent. The Arawak are then followed, at least in terms of the cultural elements, by the Carib, and we know that this happens about 100 AD. And what then begins to happen is that the cultural elements suggest, at least many anthropologists, archaeologists suggest, that these two groups then began to form a new population, a new cultural group that is generally referred to as the island Caribs. It is worth noting that this is the first group that we can say had a significant admixture from Europe, and I say that indirectly in that it was the movement of slaves by Africa that very quickly produced another culture group that is generally referred to as the Black Carib population, or Garifuna. And in this case, what we see is that population begins to be significant and in some respects almost dominant by 1635. And what we have there is a clear Carib culture throughout the Lesser Antilles, but also a significant co-mixing of culture elements. Now, what then happens very clearly is that the European populations, as they expand throughout the Lesser Antilles, this becomes problematic in terms of the slave culture, and by the end of the 1700s, the British population has relocated the Black Carib population to Roatan and to the region that is today Belize in Central America. We'll get to the Greater Antilles and that complex next week. Now, broadly speaking, and your text uses these terminologies, and several do, so I'm going to stick with it. As I said in class, we have three general complexes or ways of understanding the cultures of the time. The broad tribal groups, those are low-density populations, largely practicing slash-and-burn agriculture, and largely organized around family groups. It is a hunting-gathering system, slash-and-burn agriculture, and relatively impermanent material culture, although today we do find the idea of petroglyphs, that is rock carvings and paintings, as fairly common throughout where these types of cultures existed. We can today still see examples of slash-and-burn that have become part of small culture groups throughout the Amazon basin and into the Central American basin. Now, chieftains, and again, the Arawaks are a great example of this. We have kind of early drawings of how their culture existed. These are generally referred to as chieftains because, again, they are patrilineal. That is, that there is a family hierarchy to the chieftains often, but they are also relatively small in terms of their character and only semi-permanent in terms of their settlements. Although the settlements, when constructed, persisted for, in some cases, several hundred years. Not a lot of stonework with them, not a lot of significant material culture that lasts to today. Now, advanced civilizations, by their very nature, are complex systems with very permanent settlements, highly advanced material culture, highly advanced political systems of transport, systems of food production. Most importantly, in these advanced civilizations was the production of surplus food through a division of labor. if we look at the Incan culture, most notably, people often see it at Machu Picchu. One of the most notable characteristics of it is incredibly advanced stonework. Again, and it's often talked about, I've seen this personally, the jointery in the rock elements is so fine that today even it's difficult to slip a piece of paper or a knife blade between them. Just extremely well done material. Also, the important idea of places like Machu Picchu is that they had complex cultural meaning. And that is, again, that these high cities were both religious and retreat centers, at least in all likelihood, for royalty and nobility. Now, in the two main ones that I'm going to talk about briefly, in the Incan and then in the Aztec culture, there was also a very strong and fairly rigid class structure. And so when we think about the Incan culture, we have a nobility, royalty that is the Sapa Inca, that is the godhead. You have the royalty that are directly blood related to the Inca. And then you have nobility of privilege and nobility of blood. You have royal relatives, and then you also have the idea of nobility of privilege, that is nobility that's given. And oftentimes that's individuals that have risen through the ranks of the military, those that have risen by, in fact, oddly enough, conquest. When conquest happens, high chiefs of other cultures came into this area. You also, though, then have the, if you will, the commoners, and that is the general public, the newly integrated conquered races, and then those that were conquered that didn't integrate, and those are kind of this idea of a slave population or a servers. Now, it's important to note that within Incan social structure, it was largely a lineage of blood. That's very different than what we get in the Aztec culture. It is important, and it is worth noting, that the emperor was elected, in many respects, I guess the easiest way to say it, is really an elected official. The emperor is elected by the groups, the families or clans of nobility. Those nobilities are those that decide who will become the next emperor. And so it is important to know that that was not, in a sense, handed down father to son. It may have been, if that was the appropriate individual, but not necessarily. The other important thing is that within Aztec society, there was this very broad group that included highly respected artisans, merchants, soldiers. And so the common class included those of three kind of hierarchies that had higher skills than middling skills, than low skills. It's also worth noting that the Aztec population very clearly practiced forms of slavery on conquered individuals. The other point of this, though, is that the nobility represented a moderate portion of the population, but in a sense required a great deal of input from those below. And so that becomes somewhat complicated for the Aztec and may have been a significant contribution to their fall. It is also worth noting the incredible advances in terms of the Aztec culture as well. The development on the Mexican basin, the Valley of Mexico, just incredibly advanced technologies in terms of the building of mounds, pyramids, and ball courts. The other important thing to note is that the Aztec were extremely skilled in developing cropping and protein production within this kind of lowland swampy area. And so one of the things that you'll notice is that this type of, again, the lake and the Valley of Mexico that the central city was built on had a system of almost aquatic gardens. And so again, requiring a massive amount of labor to maintain and to extract food from. Okay, we're going to stop there for our lecture 2. This completes the major portion of this. The third lecture that will be posted over the weekend will include materials regarding the development of the contact. And so we'll see you then.